All right, thank you all. The meeting will come to order. Welcome on behalf of the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy and its president, Nancy Stevenson, who just escaped. Welcome to the garage. I should say the garages. This is the automobile garage. Our overflow audience is in the garage for the old horse and buggy. And if there's any overflow from there, they're in the chicken coop. Let me begin by recognizing the presence of some very distinguished guests. Andrew Shapiro, former ambassador of the United States to the Czech Republic. And John Kortek, former ambassador of the United States to Botswana and former deputy chief of mission in Warsaw. And Gail Naughton, CEO of the National Czechoslovak Museum and Library. And a special welcome and word of gratitude to George Drozd, pardon me, a prominent attorney, avid art collector, and good Samaritan who has devoted much of his life and in many venues to strengthening ties between the United States and his native Czech Republic. He introduced our speaker to the center and delivered him as well. We are grateful. Michael Zantovsky is a Czech diplomat serving inter alia as ambassador to Israel, the UK, and the US. He is a former Czech senator. We got two former senators here. A voluminous author and lyricist and a psychologist. His latest book is Havel, A Life, and this meeting will be followed by a book signing. The ambassador was a leader of the Velvet Revolution, which overthrew the communist regime, and in January 1990 became spokesman, advisor, and press secretary for President Vaclav Havel. His distinguished career in the government of the Czech Republic followed. Today he pursues a career of service to his country and his relations with others as director of the Vaclav Havel Library, as president of the Aspen Institute, and in many other venues. It is an honor for me to give you Ambassador Michael Zantovsky. Here you are, hiding. Thank you.
Well, Senator Stevenson, Mrs. Stevenson, thank you very much for having me here. And I apologize for using this contraption, but let me explain. At least in one way, I'm a victim of communism. Not in too many ways. I fared better than many other people, but I was born left-handed, and when I went to school in the 1950s, the communists insisted that everybody wrote with right hand, one hand, all of them. So they tried to reteach me, and I lost any ability to write with my left hand, which I already had, and I've never learned to use my right hand. So if it were not for computers and typing machines, I'd be completely illiterate. And it is an honor and a privilege to be speaking here today at the Adlai Stevenson Center for more than one reason. I understand that at one time this place was also a mental institution, and I spent the first 10 years of my career in a mental institution, and I always say it was the best training for politics and diplomacy one can conceivably get. So, but there is also a more serious reason. For someone like me, coming of age in the 1960s, Governor Stevenson was an icon of American politics, a politician, a diplomat, a brilliant public orator, someone who was able to stare down Ambassador Zorin of the USSR during the famous exchange at the UN Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a man who believed in politics of conviction and principle at the time when conviction and principle were still deemed to be important for a politician. Closer to the subject of my talk here today, he was also a believer in civic virtues and civic activism, as illustrated by his founding role in the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, which played an important role in bringing about the involvement of the United States in the Second World War and helped to save my country, Europe, and perhaps the world from the Nazi and fascist scourges. In much of this, he resembled the man I was lucky to get to know and serve with for years, the late President of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, Václav Havel. Now, the subject of my talk today, and I don't want to alarm you, is civil society dead? But the Stevenson Center is a proper place to talk about the civil society. We are in these days remembering 50 days since the heady days of 1968, when a whole decade of civic activism, initiative, and protest culminated in unprecedented public expressions of exuberance, revolt, and transformation in Prague, in Paris, in New York, only to come to an abrupt end in Memphis, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Prague again, with the deaths of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. In communist Czechoslovakia and neighboring countries, the civil society, albeit small and persecuted, continued to wage the struggle for human rights, freedoms, and dignity throughout the dark 20 years that followed, with groups like Charter 77, with the underground Samizdat publishing, and with the alternative lifestyles phenomenon drawing on the influence of American beat poetry, rock music, and the flower power movement. In 1980, it scored a temporary victory to be followed by temporary setback in Poland, where the Solidarność workers' movement first triumphed, only to be suppressed by the introduction of martial law in 1981. In 1989, it underwent a triumphant resurgence in Poland by forcing a semi-free election and winning it, in Germany, bringing the Berlin Wall down, and in Czechoslovakia during the Velvet Revolution of November 1989. And this event brought hundreds of thousands of people into the street and in a matter of weeks dismantled the communist regime without a single shot being fired. And much of the ground for this had been laid in the works and actions of dissidents like Andrei Sakharov in the Soviet Union, Václav Havel in my country, or Adam Michnik and others in Poland, who kept stressing the irreplaceable and irrepressible role of an active citizen in bringing about political change. In this struggle, essays like Havel's The Power of the Powerless served both as an inspiration and as a practical recipe for standing up and speaking. The lesson of 1989 has since been adopted and used, though with a different degree of success, by democratic movements in countries with autocratic regimes, be it in Korea and Burma, in the civic movements of the Arab Spring, or in Georgia and Ukraine. It continues to inspire dissidents in Cuba, in Russia, and in China. The plays and essays of Václav Havel are translated, read, and produced in Iran. So why are we, with regard to the incomparably richer and freer part of the world that we are fortunate to live in, asking the question, is civil society dead? There are, after all, several valid reasons why to answer the question in the negative. First of all, civic protest seems to be alive and well. Over the last decade, movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, or more recently the Me Too campaign, have drawn the attention to cases of overt and sometimes chronic wrongs, abuses, and injustice committed against both individuals and groups of people. A year ago in Korea, the non-violent candlelight revolution led to the resignation and presently conviction on charges of corruption and abuse of power of President Park Geun-hye. When I was in Seoul last fall, people explicitly raised the example of the Velvet Revolution and Václav Havel as their inspiration. In our neighboring Slovakia a few weeks ago, massive civil society protests against the uncomfortably close relationship between government officials and organized crime groups succeeded in bringing the government down and having a new one appointed in its place. That clearly shows the power that can be wielded by the civil society at moments of need. However, too often these are spontaneous emotional outcries against specific incidents or practices and often lack long-term goals, strategies, or organization. Second, the number of civil society groups in the form of various NGOs has risen greatly, and in Europe in particular, they cover almost every sphere of the social activity today. However, many of these seem to be slightly different from the traditional grassroots, organized and financed civil groups. I benefited from my recent 6 years stay in Britain by learning several new English words, and one of them is Quango, which stands for a quasi-non-government organization, which is technically and legally a civil society group, but is, however, financed in part or wholly by the government and fulfills a function often in close harmony with the government's policies in a given area. If one of the purposes of the civil society is to function as a complement, a source of initiative, and sometimes as a counterbalance to governments, then it is a relevant question if such groups meet the definition. And last, and perhaps first of all, and this is something that we are still beginning to understand, a large part of collective social activities is taking place today not in the physical world to which we have been accustomed, but in a virtual space of social networks, chat rooms, and apps. These have the enormous advantage of being able to bring vast numbers of like-minded people together in the nick of time, but so far this capability has not too often really been translated into meaningful civic or social action. It could even be said that in many respects, the instant connectedness removes people away from the world and from its problems rather than bringing them closer. In my view, these phenomena damage the functioning and the very existence of the civil society in three crucial ways. One, they weaken the integrity of the civil society groups, which are increasingly not in control of their own purpose, of their own funding, and even their own identity. Unlike in traditional groups, often built on close-knit loyalties, friendships, and shared values or principles, a Facebook group is usually a network of people who agree on certain things but with no way to determine their motivation, their commitment, and even their identity. The person you are sharing the membership in a group with can be anyone, a real person, a bot, a commercial interest, a troll, or a government stooge. Such groups can then hardly be the carriers of change. Second, the existence of groups like this facilitates a narrative that is continuously changing to such an extent that it loses all aspects of permanency and becomes a free-for-all. A Facebook post can be edited, it can be modified, it can be suppressed, it can be reinvented, and the concept of a record, a permanent record, which has been with us for centuries, certainly since the invention of print, is in the digital universe easy to relativize, distort, or even destroy. The record can be obliterated. 2 years ago, the European Parliament legislated what they call the right to be forgotten, which is in my mind a perfectly Orwellian concept designed to enable individuals to, and I will quote from the legal commentary to the legislation, which is designed to enable individuals to determine the development of their life in an autonomous way without being perpetually or periodically stigmatized as a consequence of a specific action performed in the past, unquote. And our hard-won experience during the totalitarian era has taught us exactly the opposite. We don't have a right to be forgotten. We have a duty to remember. A clear record, no matter how inconvenient to individuals or groups, is an essential part of the elusive identity we are seeking. In the absence of such record, there are no milestones on the road that can serve for orientation, energization, or inspiration. In today's civil action, you will find nothing comparable to the memorable speeches of Martin Luther King, Václav Havel, or for that matter, Adlai Stevenson. What you find, though, is a lot of tweeted drivel. And three, the distance from physical reality also liberates the participants in such groups from demonstrating their purpose and commitment in ways that matter. And that in turn makes it so much easier to advocate populist, utopian, false, or irresponsible views and solutions. In 1967, at the start of the Prague Spring, when a lot of his colleagues were outdoing each other in making outlandish, radical, and utopian claims, completely disregarding the massive forces of the totalitarian regime arraigned against them, Václav Havel wrote in the typically disciplined fashion that characterized his whole life, and I will quote, "In the end, the world will always ask each one of us with cold cruelty, what did we say and what we then did? Whether what we did was true to what we said, or whether we had the right to say something we would not do. The question is simply whether we are all capable to ultimately bear the responsibility for our words, whether we are really and unreservedly able to vouch for ourselves, guarantee our proclamations by our acts and their continuity, and never be, led by the best of intentions as it may be, trapped at a certain moment by ourselves, whether because of our vanity or because of our fear." Unquote. Responsibility was a key concept for Václav Havel and the core of his thinking about individual and society. For him, it was a responsibility rooted in what he called the ultimate horizon of being, a book, if you will, in which all our actions are recorded and will one day be judged. But this is hard to do if the record itself becomes impermanent. By the above, I did not mean to say that the situation is hopeless. On the contrary, in my work at the Václav Havel Library, which is an institution modeled after American presidential libraries and museums, and is in reality not just a library, but an influential and very active public advocacy rather than just a research institution, I meet every day with large numbers of young idealistic people who think it only natural to devote their time to all kinds of charitable, socially useful, and public policy causes, and show dedication, determination, and ingenuity in doing so. When the situation warrants it, they do not hesitate to make their voice heard. In keeping with Havel's thinking, they represent the last line of defense against all attempts to undermine democracy, human rights, and civil liberties in our country. And their role is equally important in helping to promote the causes of freedom, human rights, and equal opportunity in other countries that have not been so fortunate. Nonetheless, at the moment they are fighting an uphill struggle against the forces of populism, narrow self-interest, and nationalism. They often find themselves accused of elitism and betrayal of national interest by people representing much narrower business or political elites, some of whom have been betraying the national interest for decades. So it is one of the paradoxes of our age. So in the end, I have to admit to being agnostic on the question I posed. Is the civil society dead? It might appear that way, but maybe it's just biding its time. Thank you very much. And I will be happy to answer questions if there are any.
You take the floor.
So, the revolution can be tweeted, but can it rally the troops? But then you need the boots on the ground. I'm thinking of the March for Our Lives, and the hundreds of thousands of youngsters and their families who eventually showed up. The challenge is just not to rally, but continue, right? Then we do need all the things you talked about. But will you give any credit to social media to rally?
Well, I think you can't discount the positive contribution the social media might have. I mean, it's the best networking tool since the invention of the wheel. So it connects people, but that does not necessarily mean that it brings them into action. So the boots on the ground element is the other crucial element that the social media do not automatically bring about.
I have a question. Do you think that the tweet today and the Facebook today is a negative domino effect of really what it gets lost because people are not what the topic is all about, as far as it could become almost dangerous?
Well, you know, I don't want to sound too old-fashioned about this. I mean, there are, I use the Facebook myself, and there are all kinds of things you can learn or communicate through the social networks such as Facebook. The Twitter, on the other hand, is for me is a more problematic thing, because in 140 characters, you know, the best thing you can do is call people names. It's you know, you can't do much more than that, and that's also what the Twitter has been used for by too many people, including some very prominent and influential.
Ambassador, two things. Number one is, could you read the last sentence that you gave, because I couldn't catch the or part, the end of it. And the other question is could you explain what's Poland and Hungary and what's going on right now with their governments, because it's curious to us.
I will paraphrase. I believe that in the end, I said that the civil society may look like it's dead, but maybe it's only biding its time. So Poland and Hungary. There has been an election today in Hungary, and by the time I went into the room, I didn't know what the outcome was, but it may not be very different from what they have now, and it's a disturbing phenomenon which has been going on for several years in Hungary and for slightly shorter time in Poland, and which consists in both Poland and Hungary are, just like my country, are members of the European Union, and there seems to be a kind of a reaction against the constraints of that the membership in the European Union puts on its members, and which leads to the renationalization of both domestic and foreign policies, and also leads to some questionable legislation concerning the freedom of the media, the ability of the government to tamper with the judiciary, and with the dilution of the constitutional checks and balances that had existed until recently, and some of it has also xenophobic expressions against foreigners, migrants, Jews, George Soros in particular, and others, and the quality of the public discourse has deteriorated greatly because of this. And to be quite fair, some of it is not limited to Hungary and Poland. The xenophobic sentiments have resurfaced recently in my country, in Slovakia. Our last presidential election was probably decided by fear-mongering about migrants and foreigners. There are about 50 documented migrants in the country, and so it's not like they'll be taking over anytime soon. But still, in the public eye, I mean, this was a very powerful message for, unfortunately, I'm afraid to say, the majority of the voters, and that's why we have who we have.
Can you speculate whether or not Russia is meddling in the affairs, the political affairs of the countries you mentioned, including Slovakia?
It is almost certainly meddling in more ways than one. I mean, we do get regular reports from our intelligence agencies documenting the more than usual Russian intelligence activities in the Czech Republic and in the other countries of the region. We do have unproven speculations about Russian money having been spent in our most recent presidential election. We have a well-documented cases of Russian-funded and probably Russian written information or disinformation, depending on the way you want to look at it, servers on the internet which spread. It's not one server; it's a number, it's a network, and they spread the same kind of news about the imperialist policies of the United States and the West with regard to Russia, about all kinds of alleged immoral and corrupt practices in Western countries, and the message of these servers is then further spread around by a network of trolls, some of whom may not even be real people, but maybe bots. So there is now a government agency in Prague which is specifically tasked to document and fight the online disinformation efforts and political cybercrime, etc., etc. So there's quite a lot that shows that the Russians are active, that they involved. They obviously deny that anything like this is taking place. Then you have the cases like the case of Mr. Skripal, who was poisoned in London with his daughter by a substance that almost certainly came from Russia. The Russian foreign ministry gave out a statement that it didn't necessarily have to come from Russia, that it was also a subject of research in countries like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Sweden were among the countries that were specifically cited. Then, we have a number of cases of Russian hackers, some of which may not be politically driven, only financially driven, but some of which have some political aspects possibly. And we have just last week we have extradited a Russian hacker named Nikulin to the United States, where he's being indicted for crimes that can get him, I think, 30 years imprisonment, and until the last moment it was touch and go whether he would be extradited to the United States, where the crimes were committed, or to Russia, which also demanded that he be extradited to Russia, and we had a internal fight in the government between those who thought he should be handed over to Russia, those who wanted to extradite him to the United States. And actually the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, who was in Prague last week, intervened on behalf of the United States to get him here, so he's here now.
Need a definition on two things that civil, because I'm a little confused on this, a civil society or civil government and populist society or populist government. What are those in your mind?
Well, first of all, I would draw a distinction between civil society and civil society groups and government groups. I mean, civil society, in my understanding, is not a part of the government. It is a part of public life, and it may exert political influence or political pressures on the government, but it should not be identified with the government, because then it's not a civil society institution, it's some kind of a government stooge. And what is the difference between such group and a populist groups? Of course, many populist groups start as civil society initiatives, and some of them advocate causes that are worth debating, but they almost universally end up not being civil society groups as we know them, but usually a strong man, strong leader type of groups where one man or a very narrow group of people is producing the slogans and the charges against the government, and the rest of the people in the groups have very little to do with it. At least that has been our experience in Central Europe. It may be different in other countries, but I think the lowest common denominator for all these groups is that they usually promise something that they cannot deliver on, and that's what for me is the operational definition of the term populist.
Yeah, to follow up on that question, it seems that populism and this distrust of liberal democracy may have some roots in the elites, be they in government, in academia, or media, or wherever, have become disconnected from the general population and have failed the general population in terms of recognizing and dealing with their issues. So you have fertile ground for the kind of thing you just described there, which is the slogans, take on more power and have more force. And I don't know whether that's true in Europe, but there's a lot of people writing books about that here in the U.S. that really the elites have failed us, whether irrespective of party or whatever. I'd like you to comment, is that true in Europe?
Well, I tend to agree with that to a large degree, because it's obvious that the populist groups have not descended from Mars, or they not some new form of creation. They developed and became stronger because they were able to argue that the traditional political parties, the liberal democratic parties, failed them in some respect, and I believe that is unfortunately the case. And in Europe, I think you could point to several factors. One of the most unpleasant of these is corruption. I do believe that corruption is, in one form or another, is endemic, not just in the newly free countries of Central and Eastern Europe, but that you come across it all over Europe, and sometimes in forms that are grossly dangerous. And then there is another factor that's often discussed in this connection, and that is the process of globalization. And the fact that the global trade flows and investment flows are so dominant and so strong that they seriously limit the decision-making power of national governments, and that makes the national governments appear incompetent, incapable, and so on. And it also makes the national governments to be preoccupied with global issues, and for politicians that makes sense, I suppose. For economists that makes sense, but it doesn't make sense necessarily for most people. As Speaker O'Neill used to say, I mean, all politics is local, and 80% of people living in our countries today, I don't know about the United States, the percentages, but it's not very different, still live in a local environment, and they do not worry, they do not spend all their days worrying about Ebola and climate change and problems which may be important, but not on an everyday level for them, and they worry about their job, their school for their children, and how to get, in the United States this is not so much of a problem, but how to get the bus to the next town to go to a doctor or an office. So and they see that the governments are talking about other things, and they feel left behind. They feel neglected, and they exact a revenge.
How do you see the future of the EU? Do you think it will cohere or?
Well, the Czech Republic and the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe joined the EU in 2004. So we now have close to 15-year experience with the organization. Most of it has been beneficial, and especially in the beginning, the advantages of the single market, of the no-border regime, the so-called Schengen regime between most member countries of the EU, etc., have brought so many benefits that people supported the membership. We had a referendum on joining the EU, and I believe close to 70% of people supported the entry. But the benefits have either been exhausted or people have gotten used to them as something given, and in recent years, especially since the financial crisis of 2008 to 2012, and since the migration crisis in 2015, 2016, the support for the membership has dropped off significantly. And what is especially worrisome is that among the young people, the support for the EU is, in the Czech Republic, is lowest among all EU member countries. And so, but to answer your question, I see things about the EU that are crucial to our well-being and to our future, such as the single market, such as the free space to move around, and such as the political integration that gives Europe a bigger say in international politics and in other areas. But I also see a lot of things that are unnecessary, inefficient, and useless. In theory, the EU, the whole legal body work of the EU is based on two complementing principles. One is the integration. I mean, the EU in its basic treaty speaks about the ever closer union, and that's the integrating factor. But the other one is called subsidiarity, and that in theory argues that problems should be addressed at the lowest level where they can where they occur and where they can be solved with the least expense and the most competence. And this second principle is ignored or neglected in the EU today in many ways, and that, at least in my mind, leads to the discontent. So the EU, I think, is up for a reform, and if it does not reform, it may come to a bad end, which for us would be a disaster, because we all know about the Brexit. Well, Britain, which is a larger country, may leave the European Union. It has, it's an island. It has the history of the empire, a trading nation, trading with most parts of the world. It has somewhere else to go to. I mean, if you're sitting in the middle of Europe like we do, you have nowhere to go to. I mean, you have one direction to go to, alternative direction, and that's to the east, back to Russia. And this is something that few people would like to see happen. So I think it is in our interest that EU succeeds, but to succeed it may have to reform.
The Czech Republic has not been using the European currency. You still use your own currency?
Yes, we still use our own currency because I mean, there are different schools of thought on this, but I do not think that the question of the currency is directly related to the European integration. I think, to be quite frank, I think the currency was a mistake, and it's a mistake that will still be coming back to haunt us. I mean, in economic theory, to have a common currency, you need to have what is called an optimum currency zone, and if you look at Europe, you see that Greece on the one hand and Sweden on the other hand. Sweden is not in Euro either. They're clever, but Greece and Netherlands and Spain and Germany and Poland are not an optimum currency zone. They have different wage levels, different social levels, and different taxing systems, etc., etc. It was a political decision. To introduce euro was an agreement between French President Mitterrand and German Chancellor Kohl to introduce a common currency as a price for the reunification of Germany, which is what the Germans wanted, the French wanted the single currency, and this is what they got, and Europe has had to live with it ever since.
Do you think that the European Union would sort of sit back and in a bemused fashion watching the tariff situation between the United States and China, the People's Republic of China, start to ignite, that they would in fact, or could be in fact, the benefactors if the supply chain, which is to the tune of $375 billion net problem for the United States with China, if that were to open up? Do you think that would be an enviable position to be in the European Union?
Look, I think I saw some data in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and it is true that the growing imbalance, trade imbalance between the United States and China is such that I wouldn't really blame the administration for trying to stop it or correct it. Whether they're going about it the right way is another question. I'm not an economist, but and so far we're sitting on the sidelines. I mean, we've been temporarily exempt on the steel and aluminum tariffs, and but if this develops into a full trade war, then we will get hits from one side or another very soon, and this is something that worries me. I'm speaking tomorrow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I will be speaking about the lack of coordination between the two sides of the Atlantic on many issues, including the trade and tariff issues. 5 years ago, we were on the verge of embarking on what was called the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Nothing came out of it, and mind you, it was not just the fault of the United States. It was equally, at least in equal part, it was the fault of Europeans, and in particular the European Parliament. And it's we have become used to speaking of the transatlantic bond, but the question is whether how much of a bond it still is, and I don't know.
I like your reference to worldview geography. The view from your country is what I call a locked-in straitjacket kind of place, okay? I wonder if you could comment, or if you would have an opinion regarding the European Union arguments against subsidizing Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and how much that caused disintegration in the European Union goal.
Well, what is happening in the European Union, this is a very good question, is that the legal reality does not describe the reality on the ground too well anymore. It is one of the cornerstones of the European governments that no government will be required to pay the debts of another European government. And in Germany, this is perceived so strongly that the argument is a matter for the Constitutional Court. But since without help, Greece would have gone under a few years ago, Italy is on the brink, and the Portuguese government and the Irish government had to be helped as well. So the EU or the European Commission is very creative about devising ways around the problem by indirectly, subsidizing the economies of the countries you have mentioned, and by the policies of the European Central Bank, which is basically printing more and more euros for the Greeks and the Italians to spend. So I think it's unsustainable in the long run, but I may be wrong.
Based on the most recent presidential elections in the Czech Republic, it seems evident to me that society is pretty polarized and split, probably most that I've seen in my lifetime or since fall of communism. What do you think is behind that? Is it generational? Is it more economic, city versus country, or is there something else behind that or deeper, and what would bring it again together?
Look, it's certainly, I don't see the generational aspect too much in that, but there is a geographic and demographic aspect to it, all right. In the elections, it was very prominent that in the results that Prague and the bigger cities all voted for the other candidate, and the countryside, and in particular the economically disadvantaged parts of the countries have voted for the current president. And it brought to the fore a problem we may have been neglecting for quite some time. Prague is in fact a very rich city and a very rich region. It's today Prague runs at about 160% of the EU average. It's richer than London, theoretically. Yeah, that's what the figures say. I mean, whether the numbers are really representative, I don't know. But there was a recent statistics showing that Prague is the sixth richest European region, but some of our regions to the north and northeast are regions with high unemployment, big social problems, terrible environmental problems, and maybe we've been waiting for too long to address that problem, and we've reaped the rewards.
One last question, and that is, after the Velvet Revolution, all of you guys were sort of in prisons, Pankrat, president from prison. Where did you get your clothes?
Well, it was not so bad, Even Havel had 5 months between his last imprisonment and the Velvet Revolution. But it is true that once it started, we didn't have much time to dress up or even get a haircut. And I was one of the lucky. I had one suit to my name in which I was married, and and some of our colleagues didn't have even that. But we had a great advantage, and the advantage was our chief of staff, a good friend of mine to this day, whose name is Karel Schwarzenberg, and who happens to be a prince and one of the oldest noble families in Europe. So when we went first to London to meet with the Queen, you know, he first took us to Harrods and saw to it that we were presentable.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for a brilliant presentation.
Thanks a lot.
But we have run out of time. We must adjourn to the historic home from the historic garages for refreshments, socializing, and for signing of the book. Thank you all. We are adjourned.